Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my 2026 First Stand Group Stage Day number 5 overview and analysis video. It's the final day of the group stage. We're going to know our final 2 teams to officially qualify for the semifinals for the top 4, and unfortunately, we are also going to know our second, eliminations from both of these 2 groups, the next 2 teams to end up going out before that top 4. So, a massive day here today. Of course, we've got some much more interesting matchups than maybe we've had over the past couple of days in terms of expectations. I still don't know if we're quite at the stage yet where we are getting the matchups that are really going to determine who could potentially be favorites at this tournament, but boy, am I excited to see where these teams end up landing just in general, because I think there's been a lot of, a pretty standard League of Legends over the past couple of days, and I'm just hopeful we finally get a couple of really fun series here today on day 5. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from the series here today, and did they live up to your expectations? Of course, I'm filming all of this as the days go along, so this should come out basically right after the games end. Give me your initial thoughts. Give me your, hot takes or anything that you want to feel down in the comment section below. Very curious to know how you guys want to react to all of these games. But let's go ahead and get into the content. If you are new here, if you haven't been around for the other days, what we're going to do is go game by game across these 2 best of 5s, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and I will be giving a player of the series at the end of each series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be looking at the updated bracket, and that means the semifinals at the end of today. Of course, semifinals are tomorrow. There's no break in the action or anything. 7 straight days, 1 week-long tournament that, has a terrible format as we've gone over. Hopefully, we don't get the expected results today because it might be a couple of regional matchups in the semifinals if that ends up being the case. Hopefully, we get at least, 1 upset. That would be the hope, but we'll talk about all that at the end. We'll talk about what the wins and losses mean for every single team after we get through each series. Most of today will be spent talking about the games we got themselves. So, without further ado, let's get into our first series, because our first series is probably the closer one on paper, at least in terms of my expectations. This was my number 4 versus number 5 team in my power rankings before this tournament going head-to-head. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LEC in G2 Esports and the number 2 seed from the LCK in BNK FearX. And the reason I think this is such an intriguing matchup is because stylistically, I think they're so different. I think G2 has been getting better over the course of this year. Obviously, they didn't start particularly well. I think that they were a 2-man team. They had to 2v8 every single game in order to win it in the regular season domestically, with Skewmon and Caps really being the only pieces on this team to even have any positive contributions. But I think their macro has gotten a ton better. I think we've seen some more stable performances from the rest of this team. That being said, I still think we can see some of the negatives as we saw against Billy Gaming, where they were just not particularly competitive because they didn't have the mechanical skill in the side lanes to be able to go up against like a really mechanically talented team and be able to survive. I think their drafts in that series were fine, and generally, I think this team drafts generally well. They're one of the better Western drafting teams, in my opinion, right now in the world. Not something I typically say about the LEC, certainly not something I can say about the rest of the LEC, but I think G2 has done a better job than most other European teams at understanding what exactly should be prioritized in a lot of drafting phases. It's just their style that I think gives them something to go off of here. They are a slower paced team, but they are much more methodical than a team like BNK FearX, who wants to kind of put pedal to the metal and, play out a lot of these really aggressive fights. They're going to give you opportunities to generate gold against them. That's what they've done against every other team. If you can actually kind of turn a lot of those opportunities to, play these like 3v3s or 2v2s into like 4v3s or 3v2s like other teams have been able to do against BNK FearX, all of a sudden these games actually become kind of winnable for G2 because they are pretty good when they have gold leads going into the back end of games. It's just been super inconsistent for them to generate those gold leads against top tier talent across the world, both last year and this year. So that's kind of where I think G2 stands. I think, obviously, you're looking at Skewmon to step up here today. The jungle matchup is the one I'm by far the most intrigued by these 2 teams, not only because I put Skewmon 1 spot above Raptor, but because, again, stylistically, they kind of embody what their teams like to do. Raptor is a very feaster famine jungler who wants to play super aggressive, whereas Skewmon, much slower paced, wants to play more for team fights. I think if either side can get their style of game off, that's probably going to be the way that you can win this series and the way that G2 could potentially cause a pretty big upset here. Alternatively, if one of these junglers can just be better than the other at their phase of the game, like if Raptor is just better in the team fight stage, or if Skewmon is more active and more aggressive in the mid game and able to generate leads more consistently, I think that could also be a massive turning point. I think the junglers here are just definitely where you're going to keep your eyes. Of course, Caps is the other member for G2. I have Caps significantly above Vikla in terms of my mid lane rankings right now. Vikla, not a bad player, having arguably the best start to a year he's ever had as a player, and that's really exciting to see, but I still think Caps has been better. across the beginning part of this year. I think Caps has had to do so much for G2 in terms of, carrying them, that him and Skumond have really been the guys for G2, and that's why I expect them to be able to, at the very least, fight back in this series. Now, that's not to say BNK FearX aren't favorites. I think it's clear that they are the better team in terms of expectations in this series, and that they're the better team in terms of tape we've seen, not only at this tournament, but domestically throughout 2026 up until this point. And the reason that I'm just very concerned for G2 is this bot lane matchup looks nightmarish for them. Diablo versus Hansama is something that I think is very, very terrifying if you are a European fan and if you want G2 to be competitive in this series, because if Diablo can generate leads in the early game by playing the 2v2 more with Kellen and being able to get 1k gold up like he was able to do against a lot of LCK bot lanes, now all of a sudden Hansama's worse in the teamfight stage. Diablo is a teamfight god, and you're looking at a lane that might not be super good. Like, you need to draft to protect Hansama in this series. I think that's the only way that you have any shot of being able to win this. You need to make sure your 2v2 on the bottom side either can't be punished, whether that's like Ezreal or Jhin or whatever, right? Like, whatever defensive safe, Xayah, whatever defensive safe AD carry you want, or alternatively, you need to just pick winning 2v2 bots and force Diablo to play a hyper carry and just kind of hope that you're not getting obliterated in the early game. I think that there is a chance that this team can play from neutral, even though Hans is such a worse team fighter in comparison to Diablo. But if you're going down in the early game on the bot side, it's over. Like, there's no way for you to be able to play. You have to be able to either, be up in gold or be neutral in gold for this team to be able to function on that side of the map. I also am very worried about Broken Blade. I don't think Clear is like a phenomenal player by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think Broken Blade has been susceptible, I would say, to losing on the top side, even in situations where he probably shouldn't. So you definitely need to keep an eye out that he can play more stable than he has. He's been a pretty big liability for G2 this year. But if those things can happen, if bot lane can go kind of neutral, if Broken Blade can even be the better top laner, because mechanically I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. Clear is certainly not some sort of superstar by any stretch, but if those two things can happen, I think Skumond and Caps can actually just be better than their opposition on the other side of this matchup. There was a reason I put BFX at number 4, and it's because I do think that they have some liabilities. They just have some really big strengths, as we've seen at this tournament. I would expect Diablo to pop off. My expectation in this series is BFX 3-1. I think that was what I said in yesterday's video. I had to go back and check because I didn't remember. I think BFX 3-1. I think 3-0 is also possible for BFX if G2 just don't have the firepower to be able to deal with Diablo and Raptor and Kellen and a lot of these aggressive pieces. If Vikla can, be better than Caps in the mid lane, I think that is a massive problem for G2, but I think G2 should be able to pull out at least a game in this series. I think they've looked okay at this tournament. So the only way to know if I'm correct or incorrect about that is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this is a fantastic way for them to start this series. Basically, the best way that they could have possibly started. There were some negatives, I guess, you could have given in this series. Caps getting chunked out at level 1 wasn't ideal because this LeBlanc is certainly the part of the map that you were expecting to play for in the early game, but bot lane basically getting the same thing done to Kellen and actually punishing it significantly harder throughout a lot of the early game ended up being the big difference maker, and basically everybody on G2 just played phenomenal in this one. Their macro was excellent. They were clumping up like a death ball throughout a lot of this mid game because they understood that they weren't necessarily going to win in multiple parts of the map. That kind of negated the fact that BFX have a lot more engaged and a lot more consistent front to back team fight than them, and they were just able to use their gold lead, consistently win fights, 3-1 or 4-1, and put themselves in positions where they could just slowly grow the gold lead so that once they did get to the late game, they ended up being just so much stronger. Like, they could actually play that out. I don't hate either of these drafts. I think both of these drafts are totally fine for a game number 1. A lot of good adaptation from BFX, I think, as this draft went along, but a great F5 for LeBlanc here for G2 that I think actually does a lot for this team. I think you got a lot of comfort on this draft as well for G2, which is arguably the most important thing. So we can go ahead and talk about that really quick. G2's draft is almost all comfort, and then not that LeBlanc Caps is not comfort. Obviously, he played this forever at the beginning of his career, but it's not necessarily something you consider G2 style right now in terms of the way they like to play the game. But LeBlanc is, in my opinion, one of the more consistent counters to the Vi-Ahri duo in the mid lane, because Vi can't really lock down LeBlanc nearly as effortlessly as, she can a lot of other champions, and LeBlanc does great into Ahri in terms of the laning phase. Really hard for the Ahri to be able to punish her really at all, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go along, but outside of that, it's just some of the most played champions or the most comfortable champions for everybody else. It's the first pick Seraphine to guarantee this Ashe Seraphine lane. Even if they take away the Ashe, you have the better enchanter, we'll just say, and you can kind of play around that throughout the rest of this game. It takes it away from Kellen, who is definitely somebody who wants to play this Ashe Seraphine lane. And then once you do get Ashe on F2, this is the only champion Hansama has looked like super capable on. I'm not saying that he has been, horrendous on every other champion. What I'm saying is that this is the only champion in this meta on this patch where I would say he genuinely genuinely looks like a good AD carry, like someone you can play around at an international level. I don't know what it is about Ashe, but he feels very comfortable on the champion right now. He's player of the game for game number 1. He's kiting, like he is gliding on this champion, being able to really just force out a lot of resources to kill him in these team fights, opening up the door for the rest of the team to be able to take over. And if they're ignoring him, then he's doing a ton of damage. He's really effective on this champion. He was in the previous series that they won as well in the upper bracket against Team Secret Whales. This was the champion that he popped off on in that series in the same vein. For some reason, it just feels like Ashe is his comfort zone right now. Unfortunately, this team will not have Ashe Seraphim for the rest of this series. They were able to dominate the 2v2 after burning some sums on Kellen in the early game. Kellen kind of got obliterated in this one. We'll talk about, why I think this was just a bit of a, an overreach from BFX. I love the idea of the Nico, but why I think they just would have been better off drafting Lulu and just calling it a day, and why that might actually have won them the game. Not that I really want to go down that rabbit hole, because G2 was just better across the board in this one, but Hans and Labrov getting a huge 2v2 lead on the Ashe Seraphim was great. You get Skumon on Xin Zhao, which I think is the answer to Vi, like the answer to Vi right now in the meta. Not that it counters it or anything, but more so just that you don't really want to pick anything else into it. Vi is so strong that you need somebody that can skirmish against it in the mid game, and Xin Zhao does that while also not necessarily being something like Jarvan that needs to rely on getting a lot of kills in order to snowball as effectively. You have Broken Blade on Cassante, one of the few champions that can just be really stable and play front to back in team fights, or alternatively find their angles over the back wall. I think it gives BB more flexibility, which he's always struggled on. And again, Caps, I think, is in the best matchup for G2 in terms of this draft. LeBlanc into Ahri, I think, is very LeBlanc favored. So I like the draft for G2. That's not to say I think BNK FearX had nothing going for them. I love Yunara in this comp. I think if you can get to the late game, and specifically if you can get to the mid game, like this is doomed for G2, or at least you would think so. G2 has a huge weakness in terms of the damage they can output once that 1 to 2 item power spike comes in, in opposition to a Nico Vi diving on top of you with an Ahri to be able to follow up. It should be a lot easier for FearX to make plays around the map in the mid game, and G2 kind of, theoretically should need to weather the storm with their lack of mobility outside of the LeBlanc, but that didn't happen. They had such a big gold lead, and they were kind of clumped together as a group that they never really allowed those picks to come through. They never really allowed those, I guess, Ahri Vi plays that everybody talks about to come through, and you couldn't enable the Yunara, who just didn't have enough damage in the later part of the game, and that was awesome from G2. Like I said, the bot lane definitely fantastic in this one. I'm worried that Ashe Seraphim won't be on the board for them moving into the rest of this series, but Hansama was excellent on the Ashe in this game. He has to play like this throughout the rest of the series, because we talked about it. The biggest gap that made me favor FearX so much in this series was the AD carry role. Hans was better than Diablo, or at least more useful than Diablo in game number 1, and that is a massive turning point. I also think Skew was phenomenal in this game. He's not getting nearly enough credit for just how good he was in game number 1, at least from the casters, or what it seems like from a lot of the people online on Twitter. I think Skew was superb in this game. I considered him for player of the game. I mean, he just is on fire right now. Everything negative I said about Skewmon at the beginning of the year, throw it out in the trash. Like, clearly this guy is him. Like, in terms of how he's capable of playing right now, he looks like inspired in terms of the way that he's playing. I'm not saying he's quite at that level just yet, because I think his inconsistencies are just a little bit too much. And obviously Inspired's been doing it for a little bit longer in terms of, Skewmon has really only started playing at this level in 2026, but man, he has had a great start to the year. Caps gets down early and is in a pretty bad spot in the 1v1, which you would never really want, but an Ashe Arrow ends up saving his lane for him and, making it kind of neutral. And then from that point onwards, Caps is the target for every play from FearX and is able to dodge out of them. Broken Blade goes deathless, gets 6 kills on this Cassante, and is massive in the team fights. Again, Labrov hit a couple of big ultimates. G2 were generally just awesome in this game. There's not really a lot of negatives I can give them. They were never in a position where they were down in resources or tempo. They were always doing the right thing on the map. This is a perfect game number 1 for what the expectations were. And for FearX, you are a bit concerned with how this ended up breaking down. I think there are reasons to not panic because of the way the draft ended up going, but there are some reasons to panic. I think Kellen was awful in game number 1. He's going to get dud of the game. Not only does he burn both of his summoners very early on into this laning phase, but he steps up and gets, 2v2 killed on the bottom side. That gives all of this pressure over to the Ashe Seraphim. I like this Yunara Nico lane in isolation into Ashe Seraphim. I think Yunara is the right pick in this game, even if you don't have the Lulu. Now, if you had the Lulu, I think this game is even easier, because I don't think you would ever have to burn those summoners early, and even if you do make that mistake, you have ways to be able to, salvage that and come back, but it gives you less engaged potential to follow up on the Vi and the Ahri, even the Gnar, so I kind of understand why you would want to go for something a bit more aggressive for Kellen, but I don't know, man. Like, Kellen did not look comfortable on Nico. Get this guy back on the stable enchanters, on Lulu, on Karma, get him on those champions, because because it's clear it's a little bit different. Even though Nico is, pseudo, an enchanter, a mage, I guess, on the bottom side, it's not quite the same. You have to be a lot more aggressive, and Kellen was missing Pop Blossoms at the end of this game, which is really not ideal. Raptor also got completely out-jungled in this one. Basically, every aggressive play he went for was not there. I talked about this. Skewmon was one spot higher than Raptor for me, and that got a lot of criticism in my power rankings video. Well, at least in game number 1, Skewmon kind of took Raptor to school in terms of the way to play the map here, and it's just really impressive from Skewmon, from such a young player. Raptor, obviously, kind of a young player, has played a little bit longer than Skewmon in the LCK, but he's going to have to step up. He's been a pretty important piece. He was very good against BLG in round number 1, even in their loss, and obviously, he obliterated Secret Whales yesterday, so you need to see him start to be more relevant. Raptor and Kellen have been two of the most important players on this team throughout this year, and they just weren't good enough here. Vikla, not necessarily blaming him for this game. He was CC chained into oblivion for most of it. The Ahri was overly aggressive, but he was trying to pull back gold in a game that looked kind of lost. Same thing for Clear on the top side, not necessarily blaming him. Diablo didn't have enough damage in the back end of the game to be able to win these fights. He was getting a chance to free hit. I will give them that. They were doing a good enough job of peeling for the Yunara that if she had any gold, they actually probably could have won a lot of these team fights, and that's why I think Lulu might have actually really been the game changer, because if you have Lulu, all of a sudden you might have enough damage to be able to win some of these team fights, but Xin Zhao's ultimate was just so good, and Cassante was so tanky on the top side that maybe it didn't even really matter. Overall, for FearX, like, I am a bit concerned coming out of game number 1 that you did look like you just got out-macroed and outplayed across the map, especially in terms of the tempo plays that G2 ended up making. The saving grace is that G2 doesn't get Ashe Seraphine going into the next game. They don't get a lot of these comfort picks, Cassante on the top side, that end up making the game a little bit easier for them, and also BFX are likely going to go to something a little bit more cleaner, just in terms of like an Enchanter support or something like that to get Kellen back into the zone. Raptor won't have to play into the Xin Zhao again. I think this is going to be easier for FearX from a draft perspective moving forward, but none of that's going to matter if they can't step up their gameplay, and they have to do that now. Going down 0-2 to G2 would be a nightmare scenario when you are favorites. Having to win 3 games in a row is possible against any team, but certainly like nearly impossible. Like, it is a very difficult thing to accomplish. This is must win for FearX, and if G2 can get that 2-0 lead, you're looking at a team that is now probably favorites to move on to the semifinals. This is a big game 2. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0. And we have ourselves a very interesting conundrum on our hands, as G2 are 1 game away from punching their ticket to the semifinals of First Stand in a pretty big upset. I would say a pretty big upset. Obviously, I predicted 3-1, maybe even 3-0 for FearX in this series, but this is certainly the one matchup that you were circling on your calendar as the one where, the LCK or the LPL could potentially lose and not make it in to that upper echelon. And unfortunately for BNK FearX, it looks like they are major underdogs now to potentially make it in. They would have to win all 3 of the final 3 games of this series, reverse sweep G2 in order to get themselves into top 4. And that's off the back of G2 just being better right now. I don't think it's really all that close. The execution difference between these two teams is massive. Even when G2 were in a bad spot in the mid game, their team fighting has been so much more clean and so much more clinical throughout both of the games in this series that it might not even matter. Again, their 5v5s are so good right now, and this is the best version of what this idea of G2 can be. I do want to take an L a little bit here, because I'm going to take a couple of W's as well as we go throughout this analysis. Not that I want to, write checks before they're cashed, but I'll take the L and say that I thought G2 was not going to have this kind of pressure early on into the year. When we were talking about them in January, running back all 5 members, I was really anti that, because Hansama and Labrov to me just were not players that I thought were going to be good enough for you to be able to push forward internationally in the same kind of way. I thought stylistically this team was going to have to be too specific in order to be able to make what they did work. I thought they got to the quarterfinals of Worlds last year basically just off of luck, right? Like, I don't want to say entirely off of luck, but I compared this team to 2023 NRG. I thought they were very similar, not only in terms of play style, but in terms of like general reputation. A team that won their league. While they were probably the best team out of their league, it was more so this idea of like, in 2023, G2 was probably better than NRG. They just didn't beat them on the day. I still believe in 2025 that FlyQuest was probably better than G2. They just didn't beat them on the day. Is what it is, right? But G2 have clearly gotten so much better going into 2026. I don't think it would be a crazy statement to say that the games that we are seeing from G2, not only domestically in their playoffs, but here at this tournament, are better than anything we saw out of this team in 2025. I firmly believe that. Maybe the level of competition is a bit lower because obviously teams have not ramped up quite yet, and G2 is a team that's carrying over a lot of synergy, but I absolutely believe that they are much more clinical right now than they were last year, and for that team to make that improvement, I think is super impressive. We'll talk about their draft here because because while it's fine, I don't think it's easy. I think this is a hard game to play out, and I think it was very much a one kind of win condition, and it was hoping and praying that you either got to, well, I guess two things. It was hoping and praying that you got to late game because you're not really winning anywhere else. Maybe in the early game at times. I think it's totally fine to say you can neutralize the topside matchup, but there are a couple of lanes that I don't think are particularly good here, even if I do like the Corki Nami on the bot side. And then not only do you need to reach late game, you have to reach late game with the Rumble and the Kai'Sa not being entirely out of control. Same thing for the Mel in that same vein, because if you are going into a super fed Rumble Kai'Sa duo, even if you are a late game team, you're probably not going to be able to win those front-to-back 5v5s if the Rakan can just find one in a team fight. Luckily for them, they were able to get all the gold onto the Mel, and Raptor was a big part of the early game, and so you're going into this late game, you've checked one box, the Kai'Sa and the Rumble are at least neutral for a majority of the game, and you have this late game team comp, and then you go out and you just play the 5v5s better. That's massive. There are, again, a couple of picks that I don't like. Really notably just one. I think this is a really bad Azir angle from Caps, and I think he was punished incredibly heavily for it throughout this entire game. I think this is just not a champion that I like, first off, into Mel. I think it's a bad matchup into Mel because Mel can pressure it out super heavily in lane. Azir's typical safe tempo pressure that he can generate is just not there against Mel because she can clear the wave so efficiently and be able to roam around with the Nocturne a lot more efficiently than the Azir can with the Jarvan, but you're picking this entirely for late game. I have a hard time believing that Caps is going to be able to get in, and again, he was punished really heavily for this pick throughout all of the mid game. In fact, he was trying his best to lose this game for his team by the one player that I think in the LEC doesn't often fall for LEC Azir syndrome, this idea that you have to go for the Shuriman shuffle in order to be useful on this champion. Caps is usually by far the best in Europe at saying, no, I'm just going to stay in the back. I'm going to, hit with my soldiers, and I'm not going to worry about being the initiator. I can just be this team fight menace because that's what Azir does at his absolute best. Unfortunately for Caps in the mid game, he kind of forgot that and dashed into a couple of scenarios where he probably didn't need to die first, but did end up dying first. A lot of pressure was put into Caps. I'm certainly not going to say that, he was just running it down, but I do think that when you're talking about this gold deficit coming in, Caps was kind of prepped and primed to be the dud of the game here if things actually went according to plan with that mid-game lead that BNK FearX had. Remember, they had like a 5,000 gold lead in this game, and this was a huge, huge comeback. So Caps was in a pretty bad spot, but then you get to that late game, and you get one team fight. All you need is for one team fight to go your way. Caps was bursted down early in a lot of these major fights, but it was Skumon and it was Hansama once again stepping up in these big moments. And I hate to say it, we're going to talk about this more for FearX. Hansama is completely outplaying Diablo in this series. It's not close. Like, it genuinely is nowhere near close, and that's absurd to say. Hans has been excellent in terms of his positioning. I think he's done a great job of playing front to back, and even when he is dying, he's getting so much done before his death and, requiring so many resources to be put into him that the rest of the team can just clean up and pick up teamfight wins elsewhere. Skumon, to me, is the biggest part of that. He's going to get player of the game, although I think that there are a couple of options for player of the game. We mentioned Hansama. I think Broken Blade is kind of a sneaky good option for player of the game. He was excellent here on the Ornn. He goes deathless in this one. He has not died yet in this series, which is massive for Broken Blade on the top side, but Skumon, to me, definitely was the most active player. Every single Cataclysm he hit at the end of the game here was incredible. He was getting it onto Mel, he was getting it onto Kai'Sa, forcing the ultimate out of Kai'Sa just to get out of the Cataclysm, or alternatively trapping both Mel and Kai'Sa in the Cataclysm, and basically forcing these two big damage dealers in the last half of the game to eat every bit of AoE that the rest of the team can put out in terms of damage. It was awesome stuff from Skew, and while he might have died a little bit too much in the mid game, he more than made up for it by basically winning team fights for them with some of his engages. I thought he was unbelievably good in this game, and Skumon continuing to prove, kind of what I said, and, I'm going to take a victory lap in this segment. We'll see how this ages throughout the rest of the series. Skumon's better than Raptor. Like, he's just a better player than Raptor is. I feel very good about ranking Raptor as the number 6 jungler at this tournament. He is playing like it in this series right now. Skumon has absolutely been more effective, and he's been better. Now, Hans has also been better than Diablo, so how much stock can you really put into that? But, it's a crazy output. I think, again, Broken Blade has been great across this series. This is easily the best series he's played so far at this tournament. He obviously was okay in the playoffs. I would say he had a lot of good moments in the playoffs. He was terrible in the regular season for them. If this guy can step up, play tanks, and just be consistent in the late game, that's best case scenario for G2. I do not want to see them up 2-0, pulling out something crazy on the top side. Just play more tanks, man. Lock in Sion and go to your game 3 win. Like, I just want to see that happen. Labrav was very stable, and here he was dying first in team fights, but again, getting a lot off and saving his AD carry. In a lot of instances, he's been better than Kellen in this series. Caps was the only player that I don't think was playing playing particularly well, and in the late game, he was still doing a ton of damage. He was just getting targeted a lot. It was really his mid game that ended up being a big problem for G2, but they were able to overcome that, get to the late game, and win those team fights. And for FearX, they just don't have an answer. They are losing every 5v5 right now, something that they used to be incredibly good at in the LCK. They just don't have that execution at the current moment. Diablo, for me, is the obvious player of the game. How many times did Diablo die first in a team fight, getting Azir shuffled because he's jumping on him 1v1 to try and burst down the 1-in-7 Azir or whatever it was at the time? Getting cataclysmed and just, standing there and having to die, getting caught out by being the player who's the most far forward on FearX. This is the Diablo problem, right? This is the side of the coin. Like when it flips, when Diablo's playing awesome, when it looks great, it looks great. He gets 2 pentakills at a tournament for the first time since 2014, and it's like, oh, that's incredible. And when it doesn't go well, he's going to be the first person to die, and he's going to be actively losing your team the game. It's a bad look for Diablo. He had the chance to win this, and he actively threw it away. I think he was the worst player on the team. I think Clear was fine. I think he needed to be a bit more aggressive on the Rumble. Again, trying to find these flank angles isn't always what you want to do. You want to get on the back line, but sometimes you just want to use that equalizer to try and be a big menace up front to dissuade a lot of these aggressive plays. G2 had free access onto champions like Mel and Kai'Sa because the Rumble was playing so passive throughout a lot of these late game team fights. Kellen, I actually think, played fine. Maybe you would rather have him on an Enchanter, if only because it's harder to babysit Diablo if you're playing Rakan than it is if you're playing Lulu. But at the end of the day, I think Kellen had a lot of really nice engages in this game. It just didn't end up mattering. Vikla was Omega fed. Vikla has been way better than Caps in lane. I think that is something to keep in mind. The 1v1 has come out of both of these games with Vikla having a pretty strong lead without any sort of interference. So I'm interested to see if that matters, but he couldn't do anything in the late game. He was getting targeted and taken down in most of these fights, and Raptor is getting out jungled. He's getting out tempoed, and he's certainly getting out team fought here on the Nocturne. He had a good mid game, but that was it for him. This is not looking good for FearX. They absolutely look like the weaker of these two teams, and now you're down 0-2 going into a game 3. Again, if you want to survive at this tournament, if you don't want this to be your final series and for you to get upset by the West, you have to win all 3 of the final 3 games. I think it's possible for this FearX team to do it. Diablo just needs to pop off 3 games in a row, which I think is certainly something they can do. And again, Vikla has been better in lane than Caps. If Raptor can just step up and actually be good in one of these games better than Skuma, that's going to change a lot. But right now, the advantage is very much in G2's corner, and they don't just want to move on to the semifinals. There's a chance that they could sweep FearX out of this tournament in game number 3. Are they going to be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 3 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take this series in a clean 3-0 sweep. And you know what? I was kind of hoping and praying. I was like, please, no 3-0s. Please, no 3-0s. I think this is a bit of a different circumstance. We'll just say that. I still would have preferred 4 or 5 games because obviously we've just been so starved for long series at this tournament through the last couple of days. This is the 5th best of 5 in a row that has only gone 3 games. But for it to be a massive upset in a 3-0, I think I will take that in terms of some interesting storylines. G2 have not only punched their ticket, obviously, over the LCK, which is massive. G2 has always had an easier time, I should say, not an easy time, but an easier time beating the LCK than maybe the LPL. It's kind of something that we've talked about historically with them, but also they punched their ticket to the top 4. Now, unfortunately for G2, it does not get easier from here. We'll talk about that in a bit, because it does seem like, I believe the format sets it up for them to go up against Gen G in the semifinals. Not necessarily what you want to hear as a G2 fan, but even being there in the first place is already such an accomplishment. They have achieved their goal. I think their goal, their dream at this tournament was to get top 4, and they did that today in dominating fashion. For BFX on the other side, what a disappointing series. I mean, this is one of those things where, like, I was lower on BFX coming into this tournament, I think, than a lot of other people. I talked about that in my primer, put them 4th. I had a lot of people telling me that I couldn't be taken seriously as an analyst because I had Raptor at 6th, or because I had BNK at 4th instead of at 3rd, and JDG is nowhere near as good as BFX, and all of this stuff, right? Well, here you go, man. Like, Raptor just got Omega out jungle by Skuma 3 straight games. I mean, game 2, maybe you could put an argument in that Raptor was fine because his mid game was okay on the Nocturne, but he certainly wasn't useful in team fights. And then games 1 and 3, he was just outplayed. Like, there is no conversation. He was the weaker jungler in this series, and it was not particularly close. BFX, one of the big reasons I put them lower was, oh, they have a good chance of being a team that could upset him, potentially be a team that gets closer to like top 2. They're also more likely to miss the semifinals than a team like JDG. That was the exact verbiage I used in my primer, and that's exactly what happened. They're just a very flippy team. Their highs are high and their lows are really low, and you just can't really account for which version of them is going to show up, especially because their playstyle is so specific, and that's exactly what happened here. G2 stylistically, not only, they didn't slow the pace of the game down in this one, I shouldn't even say that, like they just outplayed BFX in a lot of key moments because they can make mistakes on the map, and this time they got punished for it. This is a bad result for BFX. I think they're going to feel very defeated going back to the LCK with this kind of result, and unfortunately, I don't want to get like too hyperbolic, and we'll talk about this more when the LCK of course comes back for the spring split, but like this kind of erases a lot of the momentum that BFX generated domestically. I think they're going to be going back with a lot less confidence and a lot less momentum than they did going into this tournament, and I just hope that that doesn't completely tear apart what they built at the beginning of this year. But for G2, I mean, what a result. Scumon's player of the game for me for game 3. Not quite player of the series, although he got 2 player of the games. I know that feels kind of weird on this channel, but, we'll talk about it. I just don't think he was the player that I wanted to highlight as player of the series here, but he was excellent. I mean, there was a true jungle gap in this series. Scumon was absolutely better than Raptor, and what did I say in my preview video, or my preview in this video for this series? Whichever jungler was better was likely just going to win the series, and especially Scumon being so aggressive and active in side lanes across this map, he was basically doing the Raptor thing to Raptor and forcing him to just sit there and watch the game as it imploded. Really impressive stuff. Scumon is legit. I think at this point, there is no argument. This guy is like one of the better junglers in the world. He really has stepped up at the beginning of this year. He was the best player for G2 domestically. I think Caps was close, but I think Scumon was better domestically. And he's been by far their best player at this tournament. I mean, he has been super influential in why this team is moving forward. Really happy for him. And, I think he has proven himself to be the right choice. I think Yike is a great player, but it's clear that G2 saw something in Scumon with higher upside. It took him a bit to get there. I think last year was definitely a bit of a concern for me in terms of his stylistical performance, but he played really well at Worlds last year and got that team to the quarterfinals. And then, he's been a superstar in the LEC. He might be the best player in the entire region. In fact, I probably would call him the best player in the entire region right now. Him, Caps, and Busio, I think, are the top 3. He might have that number 1 spot. Scumon deserves all the praise he's going to get coming out of this series and going back to Europe at the moment. Player of the series, though, for me, is going to Hansama in the bot lane. The player that I have ruthlessly, I guess, cut down over and over again in a lot of my primer videos. Hans can have some good performances, man, and this was awesome. This is the best he's played in years. I firmly believe that, even when he pops off domestically in like domestic finals against Koi or KC, like it's not quite the same, right? Where it just feels like he's getting handed a lot of things domestically because it's so easy to be able to generate resources against LEC teams with how bad their drafting and macro tend to be, at least domestically. Sometimes they get better going, international, but it's been a problem for that league over the past couple of years. Domestic play has been quite low for a lot of teams there, but Hans coming to this tournament, having a great series against Secret Whales, or at the very least having a couple of good games against Secret Whales, and then coming out here and just being better than Diablo, like Omega gapping him in the AD carry role. That was the difference here today. There is no question who the better AD carry on the map was. Hansama was better at everything in comparison to Diablo. They were winning in the 2v2. Hans was more consistent in the team fights. He wasn't getting caught out. He was pumping out more damage. I mean, this was an awesome performance from Hans. I'm certainly not going to discredit when he plays well. I just want to call out that it's not always like this, but when it is, boy, is it really good. And this actually does raise my opinion of Hans quite a bit, even though he was as bad as I predicted in the LEC, right? Like, this guy was a true liability to G2 throughout the regular season. He stepped up major in this series and was one of, if not the biggest piece, and that's why I'm giving him player of the series here. Broken Blade was awesome. 3 tanks in a row and 3 solid games from G2. Please don't forget this. I'm so tired of them going for these wacky counter picks on the top side and them not working out. Just play the meta. Just play to protect topside and let your good players win you the game. It's really not that hard, especially because you're a team that likes to scale games out into the late game. Just put Broken Blade on Sion and Ornn and Cassante. Like, I hate to just get really mad at this team sometimes, but they overthink draft all the time. And in this series, they were awesome in draft. And I think they were great in draft in the previous couple series at this tournament, but it's really nice to see that they, kind of said, okay, whatever, man. Scumon's our best player. We want to play for Hans and Labrav on the bottom side to make sure Diablo and Kellen don't get out of control. Broken Blade just play safe, and all of a sudden, magically, the team becomes more consistent. It's not a coincidence. I promise you. Please follow up on this throughout the rest of not only this tournament, but this year G2. It's clearly your strategy for winning games against teams that are really good. Caps tried his best to throw the series at points. He was really bad on the Azir, in my opinion, and it's a pick that I don't think was particularly good. He was down in lane in game number 1 on the LeBlanc, even though he didn't end up dying. I think he was the worst player on G2, and they still were able to 3-0 BFX, and that is an awesome sign. I mean, that's best case scenario. He popped off in some of the later team fights here. I'm not trying to take everything away from Caps, but Caps was the weakest player on the team, and they still were able to perform like this. That's insane. Lebrov had a pretty good series, especially games 2 and 3, where I think he did a great job of setting up the rest of the team. He was on pace for player of the game. Just didn't pop off enough in the later part for me to consider it, but G2 are awesome. I mean, this team looks really fun right now. I think they've sped up their pace of game coming to this international. Their drafts have gotten significantly better since their domestic play, and I think overall they have a really good understanding of, you know, where the game is at right now. They have earned their spot in the semifinals. They are clearly a top 4 team at this tournament. And for BFX on the other side, this is a awful loss. Like, I already talked about just how bad this is from a, you know, I guess overall perspective. For an LCK team to not be making top 4 at any international tournament, I think is definitely disappointing. You know, the LCK number 2 seed, I should say, but specifically for this team, their first ever major international, all this hype around their bot lane and around their jungle, and, you know, mid lane's playing better than normal, like all of this stuff, and for them to just go out 3-0 to, you know, G2, a European team, and all due respect to the LEC, like, that's not the expected result, right? Like when you see LCK number 2 versus LEC number 1, that should be a pretty easy 3-0 in most cases. But BFX is not your normal LCK number 2. They are super inconsistent. They don't really have the mechanical talent to fight their way back from bad deficits. And quite frankly, they got out team fought in basically every single game of this series. And that really ended up coming back to bite them. Raptor is dead of the game for me for game number 3. He got out jungled. Like, I'm sorry. I hate to say that the victory laps I know get really annoying, but I feel like I've earned this one because Raptor is not who people think he is. Like, he just isn't, and I've been talking about that for a while. I'm a big Raptor defender. In fact, all of the last few years, I've been pounding the table. I'm like, Raptor's like the 5th or 6th best jungler in the LCK, and, you know, it didn't seem like that was consensus opinion. Now people have overcorrected in the other direction, talking about him as a top 3 jungler in the LCK, and I'm like, man, my opinion on Raptor from 2024 has not changed to now. He's the exact same player that he has been over the past 3 years. And it just is the case. Like, I hate this reactionary idea in League of Legends that you are as good as your team is. Raptor is not different because his team is better around him. Raptor is the same player. He can still generate the same advantages. He can still be very successful, but when it's not working, it's not working. Again, he is a perfect successor on this same organization to someone like Krako. I really don't see them as all that different players. Krako was Rookie of the Year over Owner. Don't forget that back in like 2021 or whatever it was, back in the day. Like, Krako had some awesome moments in the LCK. Raptor to me is a very similar player to Krako, and he can also have similar terrible moments as we've seen from Krako throughout a lot of his career in that same vein. Unfortunately for Raptor, he was not nearly as good as Skumon, who is clearly becoming a star jungler globally right now, and that was a big problem. The other big problem, Diablo and Kellen sucked today. Like, I'm not going to put it lightly. They were bad. Diablo was constantly walking up and, you know, being front-facing in team fights and instantly dying first. If you're dying first in every single fight as the AD carry because you're on the front line, something is going wrong. I get that that's part of Diablo's, you know, big appeal, is that he's going to have these big pop-off moments, and then, you know, sometimes that's going to cost him in the end, but it cost him almost every single time in this series because G2 was playing fights a lot cleaner. Kellen, I don't think had a great series. I think he was okay, actually kind of okay, pretty good in game number 2 on the Rakan. The Poppy never got anything done here. He was getting CC chained into oblivion and basically was entirely useless. If you wanted to give him dead of the game, I'm certainly not against that. This is the first game where Vikla finally felt like he was outplayed. He was actually pretty good through the first couple of games, and Clear did nothing on the top side. He picked a couple of counter pick aggressive matchups and got nothing into these tanks. Like, BFX looked like a mediocre LCK team, and I'm worried that that's just who they're going to be when they go back to play domestically. You know, I'm honestly leaning towards that. You know, again, I hate to be a BFX doubter, but I think this is a good team. I just don't know if they're going to be able to be like a top 2 or 3 LCK team. I think them being the LCK number 2 seed was deceptive, and that's why G2 was able to come out here and just outplay them. I don't think they have the consistent mechanics to be able to step up and play at this international level, and I think that kind of got proven in this series. And then for G2 on the other side, this is best case scenario. They're in top 4. Again, it's probably the farthest that they're going to go, you know, playing Genji in the semifinals, but to even be in top 4 in the first place, again, has to be considered a major success, a major win for this organization. This was best case scenario, in my opinion, for first stand for them, and I think they're going to be going back domestically with a lot more confidence, and I can certainly say from my perspective, I'm higher on G2 right now than I have been at any point in the last, like, 15 months. Then moving on now to our second series of the day, and it's another one that I think is kind of interesting on paper. Hopefully we get as interesting of a series as we got with our first one. It's a matchup between the number 1 seed from the LCS in LYON and the number 2 seed from the LPL in JD Gaming. Of course, this is, once again, a matchup where the LPL team in this case is favored. The Eastern team is favored over the Western one, but there is some hope that potentially the Western team can step up and, outperform maybe what the expectations are for this series. That did end up going according to plan in the previous one because G2 ended up getting that clean sweep. We'll see if LYON can follow up on the good form established by G2 in that series. I have less faith in LYON than I did in G2. I talked about that a lot coming out of the first couple of matchups of this tournament. I had G2 higher in terms of my power rankings, but I think one of those teams has been significantly better at this tournament. LYON, quite frankly, has looked terrible so far at first stand. I think they've been one of the worst performing teams just from an overall perspective. Their drafts are the worst of any team at this tournament. Their mid games are the worst of any team at this tournament. Their macro is some of the worst of any team at this tournament. It's really not been a good look for LYON from my perspective. I kind of went in on this team yesterday when they lost, of course, to Gen G, and it's Gen G. I'm not trying to panic or freak out. Like, getting destroyed by Gen G is just part of the process of going to an international tournament. I'm sure everybody is going to go through that. JDG knows what that's like on the other side of that matchup, but just the overall way, like the process behind how LYON are going behind in some of these series is really starting to frustrate me. It feels like they don't have a good read on the game at the current moment, but what they do have is Inspired in the jungle, and genuinely, that is the reason they are at this tournament. That is the reason that they can be competitive in a series like this. I think they have the better jungler between these two teams. Junja is a good player and on his best day can have some awesome performances, but Inspired is really one of those players that I think can change the game, kind of like we talked about with Skewmond in the previous series, where if he can be the better jungler, if you can have all that tempo, the game does become a bit easier, and we saw that for a bit, I guess, against Gen G when Inspired had a couple of nice moments, and then we also saw that a lot against Loud, where they probably don't win that series, I should say, without Inspired playing nearly as well as he did. So you're hopeful that he can step up here today. He is LYON. Like, he is the entire team in terms of how they play. The reason that their macro is so bad is because their players have no idea what they're doing in side lanes throughout a lot of the mid game. Saint, in particular, is one of the weaker macro players at the tournament, like full stop, if not the weakest. He just doesn't understand where he's supposed to be at any point on the map. He utilizes a lot of his cooldowns and a lot of his resources to catch side waves and to be, a little bit more selfish in terms of the way he acquires resources. And because of that, oftentimes Inspired kind of has to play isolated in a lot of these matchups, which makes his effect on the game significantly less. If Saint can start getting out on the map and be a bit more consistent at being able to play for his jungler, then things are obviously going to get better for LYON. I'm not saying I'm giving up on that being the case, but I just don't know if that's going to happen here today against JDG. And of course, I think the main thing is that Berserker and Isles have to be good. Like, they were not good at all against Gen G. I think they've been, really disappointing as a duo in terms of the 2v2 throughout the year, even domestically up until this point. And I really don't think that Isles has looked like an international caliber support. I think this could be a matchup that goes awry, but Berserker is going to have to be good enough today to at least compete with Gala in terms of resources. If they can't do that, they're likely not winning mid. They're probably not winning top lane, although technically it's possible. Xiaoshu's just a much better laner. Berserker is going to need to step up and be that secondary carry, so Inspired has someone he can play for in this particular series. For JDG on the other side, honestly, I think they match up incredibly well into LYON. LYON, a team that prefers to play slow and play for late game team fights because that's when they feel like they can be the most creative. JDG are probably the best team at the tournament outside of Gen G, I guess, at playing slow and playing for late game team fights. And so if LYON does opt into that direction, JDG just might have better execution in terms of that game plan and that play style. And obviously, that's not ideal. Junja, somebody that I don't think is going to get super capitalized on in the mid game here because LYON's mid games are so bad, but his early game could be a bit of a problem because Inspired is a very aggressive early game jungler. He's just not super aggressive in the mid game in terms of how he pulls the trigger on things. He's got to make sure he doesn't fall behind in terms of resources. Outside of that, I favor JDG in every single lane. Xiaoshu is a great laner, not a great team fighter, although we saw a bit of a flip of that in the previous series against Loud. I imagine he's going to be better in the 1v1 basically no matter the matchup into Dokla, unless Dokla continues to pull out these crazy counter picks, in which case I think it's massively JDG favored, of course. And then in the mid lane, Honkyu is definitely better than Saint. I think Saint has struggled going into players that he's already mechanically better than. Honkyu is not a player that I think Saint is mechanically better than, and Honkyu is better at playing the map as well. I think that's a very bad matchup for LYON. And then Gala and Vampire should be able to completely abuse Isles down in the support position. And Berserker's not exactly been like an A+ caliber player either across this year. I really think LYON have their backs up against the wall in this particular series. But if you have Inspired, you have a chance. I just think JDG should be able to 3-0 this series and get their way into the semifinals. We'll see if LYON can pull off another Western upset today, or if JDG can accomplish their goals and get where they want to be into that top 4. The only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 1, but boy, is it not a clean one. They're going up 1-0, and it's just barely. I mean, genuinely, this is one of the funniest games of the tournament. Not the funniest, because we've seen some pretty funny games at this tournament up until this point. I think specifically we are looking at, a couple of the BLG, BNK FearX games that we can talk about being, particularly funny, but this is, right up there, at least in my opinion, for how this game has potentially gone down. LYON have a lead the entire game. They play the map, pretty well. Their mid game is really solid. They continue to grow their lead. They lose one team fight around what is essentially Seoul for them. Not essentially, what would have been Seoul for them. They lose the fight, and immediately JDG go take Baron, charge the base, and end the game. Like, it's actually ridiculous. JDG had a gold lead for maybe a minute and a half of this game's runtime, and they're still able to pick up the win. This is a super low kill game, 8-6 in terms of overall kills at the end here. It's just LYON continuing to fumble the bag at the end, and really, I think this is emblematic of who LYON are as a team. They can do so many things right, but when they do things wrong, they do them very wrong, and they instantly lose the game because of it. And it just means that they are not a team that's going to be particularly successful at a tournament like this. It's a frustrating loss for North American fans, considering just how good this team looked for a majority of the game, but that was all Inspired. I mean, genuinely, this was Inspired just proving that he is the best player on the Rift, arguably, between these two teams. I'm not going to say that he is. Junja, Hongq, those players are very good, but Inspired was really good at the beginning of this game on Nocturne. He was able to invade and take away Junja's Raptors and play that level 1 incredibly well, and then he utilized his ultimate perfectly throughout the rest of the game to constantly be picking up golden resources and getting golden resources on his teammates throughout a lot of the mid game as well. This was an Inspired masterclass for a majority of this game, and then again, it's one team fight down the stretch of this game at that Soul Dragon where Junja just basically goes unkillable. Saint is quite late to the setup, so they have to walk into the river, into Karma, into, Orianna, into Xin Zhao, and unfortunately, they just don't have the combat power at that point because they hadn't been aggressive enough at pushing their advantage to win the fight. They end up losing it. The Xin Zhao is unkillable. Baron happens, and they push down to end. It really is a very formulaic and simple end. At the end of the day, LYON's macro and a big mistake coming in from Saint to be late to that fight really ended up costing them and basically ending the game on the spot. Junja, for me, is player of the game. I don't think he was great in this one. Like, I think he was behind in tempo, but when he was looking for plays, almost all of them were good plays. Generally, it's hard to play into Nocturne as Xin Zhao if you get behind level 1, but he was still active on the map. He just wasn't able to actually win a lot of the exchanges. When he got grubs, I think that was a really good trade, even if the Dragons were getting stacked on the other side, because it allowed his Orianna to play a lot more aggressive throughout the mid game, which, while it didn't necessarily help, could have theoretically helped. And of course, Junja obviously was the massive piece in that final fight where he was basically unkillable with Karma and Orianna shields right on top of him, and Gala following up with all of that damage. He had a really great end of the game, and when you're talking about the most important team fights, I think he was the most important player. Therefore, he's player of the game. But overall, I don't think anybody on JDG played phenomenal. They just won one fight down the stretch. Xiaoshu and Hongq were ulted multiple times by Nocturne in side lanes, ended up dying to that. Saint as well, able to catch some of them out, get some free gold onto the Galio, into the Gnar from the Nocturne. But it's not like the solo laners were dominating. They just, were able to play alongside the Xin Zhao in that final fight. Yunara and Karma were completely, behind throughout a majority of this game. Gala was down 30 CS on Berserker for a majority of the laning phase, and then obviously just had a couple of team fights where it ended up winning. I wish I could sit here and talk a ton about JDG and about the way that they played this game, but mostly they kind of just bled out, kept up in CS, and then eventually won a fight and won the game. It's actually an insane way for this game to have gone, but JDG are probably going to be fine with it. There's just not really a lot of analysis that I can generally give on that. Then for LYON on the other side, the biggest negative you can give is that Saint's macro continues to be the X factor that brings this team to losses. I'm sorry, I just don't know if this team is ever going to be competitive with Saint and Isles. I hope I'm wrong, and Isles wasn't really all that bad in this game. In fact, he had a great laning phase. I think he did a great job in the 2v2. That's something to express, is that Berserker and Isles were kind of brought together as a duo for LYON to make sure that Berserker could get a lot of leads 2v2 isolated on the bot side in a meta, where I think that's really important. Isles is not a good team fighter. He's really not a good flanker, not a creative playmaker. playmaking engager. He is somebody who is kind of known for being strong in lane, and that is what they brought him onto this roster to do. And he finally started to kind of push that forward in this game where they were able to generate a pretty big lead. Inspired was doing a good job of getting leads elsewhere on the map. Saint wasn't doing a great job in the mid lane, but he ended up being valuable. I mean, the ultimates throughout the map just are great for Galio in general, even if he overused them on plays that didn't necessarily need them throughout a lot of the mid game. Doko picks up 2 free kills from some inspired ganks and overall plays the Renekton matchup well. He avoids a gank on the top side because of Saint utilizing that ultimate. Like, there's a lot of positives to say about this, but at the end of the day, Saint was late in terms of utilizing his resources. He had already used his ultimate when he backed before this dragon fight. They give up pressure into the river, and JDG are able to establish tempo there, and that means that LYON has to walk into them, which is the only thing they can't do in order to win that game. They don't have enough damage, and they lose instantly. Like, it is that mental mistake that just ends up costing them, and that is the difference between like LYON and basically every other team that is still alive here at this tournament, is that they just don't do those little things well at all. Like, they don't understand exactly where they're supposed to be. This has been a massive problem for them throughout all of this year. Their macro is genuinely awful. Like, it's not even just mediocre. It's like bad, like actively bad. They make bad decisions constantly, and I think Saint is the biggest culprit of that. I think this was probably going to be one of their better chances to win a game because they got such a big early game lead. You kind of go for the gambit here. You give over Orianna, Karma, Xin Zhao, Yunara, Renekton, basically 5 of the strongest champions in the entire game in order to get counter picks on those specific champions on the other side of the matchup, and that's exactly what you did. You got a comp that I think in theory should be able to beat a lot of the strongest picks in the game, and while you got that early lead, you can't make mistakes with the comp that you drafted, and that's what they did. They made a massive mistake in terms of their setup and their objective setup specifically around Soul, and they paid the price. They paid the entire game for it. So pretty frustrating for LYON. Hopefully they can bounce back in game number 2. There's just not really a lot of analysis that I can give. Inspired was excellent in game number 1. He's going to have to do the same in that second game. JDG just kind of need to ride this wave. It's clear that they have better execution towards the end of these games, and that's where LYON is probably going to want to play. You just have to make sure you don't get into as big of a deficit going into game number 2 because you barely got out of it in game number 1. So can JDG utilize this momentum that they got to have a much cleaner second game, or is LYON going to show that they should have won game number 1 and even up the series here? Well, the winner of game number 2 was LYON. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and we have ourselves a bit of a banger on our hands through the first 2 games. Both of them have been super explosive, crazy fun, and really back and forth between these 2 teams. It really did feel like this one was entirely in JDG's hands, and this time it's their turn to throw. This is very JDG. I want to let people know, LCS fans or, fans of other regions that maybe only watch my international content. If you don't know about JDG, you are learning about JDG. This is a team that if they're down 5k gold going into 20 minutes, they're going to win the game. And if they're up 5k gold going into 20 minutes, they're going to lose the game. It's just ridiculous how consistent this team is inconsistent. I think that's the funny term that I've been using over the course of the beginning of this year, where it's just like this team will find a way to win or lose any game so long as they're not already in that game state going into the end game. It's just very funny how it ends up working out, but this time it's LYON's turn to find multiple fights and really drag this game out and get to a spot where they should be able to pick it up. Now, JDG do a good job of fighting back towards the end, pushing this to a game where it's 3 dragon versus 3 dragons, and that's obviously a little bit scary here for LYON. They're able to pick up a Baron, and all of a sudden, things can get a little bit nervous for LYON fans, but they win the most important fight by catching out a really important member in Hungkyu on the Annie. On the other side of this, they continue to push down. A really nice catch by Inspired to be able to pick up the rest of the team, and then once Berserker is able to pop off and free hit in team fights, it's able to be won. This is obviously a super close game. Awesome end call, by the way. So many teams would not choose to call for the end right here, but this is absolutely the right call. This game gets more and more difficult the more you allow JDG to continue to go back and buy items, and you don't want to have to risk the game on another fight. You found your fight, go and try and end the game. Even if you don't end it there, I do think that that's probably your best chance to be able to win this, and I think it was the right call, and obviously it was. It ended the game in favor of LYON, but let's go ahead and talk about these 2 drafts because I think they both do similar things just in very different ways. I kind of like the LYON draft, but I think I like it for different reasons than maybe some other people do. I think this gives you quite a bit of efficiency towards the end of the game. If you have gold on your primary carries, specifically obviously the Victor and the Corki, this game becomes a lot easier. K'Sante should be able to tank up a ton of the lower damage carries like the Annie and the Jhin on the other side. Same thing with Malphite, and Nami's obviously going to give you quite a bit of sustain and free extra damage in the later part of the game. The problem that I have is just it's a lot harder to play LYON's comp than JDG's comp, in my opinion. You have a lot of straightforward engage execution coming out from JDG, and while I don't think they're in a great spot in terms of their laning phases, Rumble should be generally fine on the top side. You know, Jhin, I think, should be fine into Corki. That didn't end up happening. Obviously, bot lane was a massive advantage in favor of LYON, which is something we're definitely going to talk about. It has been across both of the first two games, and I think that's something that, you know, we definitely need to lock in on as these games continue to go on throughout the rest of the series, but theoretically, you should have pressure or at least neutrality in a lot of these lanes, even if mid lane is not a particularly good matchup, and you have more easy tools to execute and engage in the mid to late game. I still prefer LYON's draft. I think it's going to be a little bit stronger moving forward, mostly because of the Victor. I think this is actually a really hard game to deal with Victor in isolation. Now, obviously, Saint was terrible, and we're going to talk about that. He kind of threw away the entire point of this champion, quite frankly, in the early game, but I think in theory, I like the draft from LYON. It just didn't end up working out in the way I thought at all. Berserker is player of the game. What a massive 2v2 gap down on the bot side. At this point, we can say pretty handily that LYON are crushing the bot lane, and that is really the biggest difference right now between these two teams, is that the bot lane for LYON is just better. Isles has been phenomenal in the laning phase. This has been a real standout performance from him. I really questioned him not only in the previous series, but, you know, throughout basically his entire career in terms of whether he can be an international caliber support. And of course, when he joined this team, there was a lot of, you know, questioning. He has that quote where it's like, oh, it's very different going up against like LPL and LCK talent. You can't get away with the things you got away with domestically. And it's like, yeah, I think that unfortunately has been very clear in terms of the games that we've seen so far on stage. But they have clearly learned pretty quickly, because this 2v2 is very much going their way. And Berserker got Omega fed in this game. He was 3,000 gold up at like 11 minutes, up like 80 CS on Gala. I understand people hate Jhin. This is not a Jhin problem. Jhin's not supposed to go down 80 CS. This is them really misplaying the bot lane 2v2 and putting themselves in a position where they just get absolutely destroyed. There wasn't even inspired intervention. Like, this was not a 3v2. This was not, you know, LYON putting resources onto the bottom side. Genuinely, it was just that massive of a gap between Berserker and Isles and Gala and Vampire in the 2v2. That's what got them across the finish line. Again, Berserker's getting it because he also did a boatload of damage at the end of this game, but Isles was phenomenal, and he deserves a lot of praise. Dokla's KDA might not look particularly good because the top side was a bit of a mess in terms of how that ended up going down. Not that he was terrible, just that, you know, Rumble into Cassante goes the way that it does for the Cassante. Generally, you will eventually get to a point where you can tank, but his late game heroics, I think, were actually pretty massive for this team. His positioning was great. He was constantly catching out Primo members, and specifically that catch onto Annie basically to end the game was, you know, super influential. So credit to Dokla. Inspired was playing this game as patient as possible, and I was getting ready to flame him for it the moment that we got here and this team lost. You know, I was really kind of sitting there like, okay, like if that's how it's going to be, if this is the way that this is going to go, then obviously, you know, he's gonna get a lot of hate for this game, and I think it was gonna be rightfully so. He didn't even pull the trigger on an ultimate until he was level 13, and he missed it, and it's like, oh my god, like this guy, I understand he wants to be patient, he understands that his comp theoretically outscales, but it's not like JDG don't scale incredibly well. Like Rumble Wukong alone scale very hard. And it's going to be difficult for the enemy team to break through all this CC chaining coming in from JDG, because they have a lot of targets that, if they're locked down, are just instantly dead. So, you know, JDG, it's not like they don't scale at all. I just think LYON scale harder. And so I understand the idea of LYON, and I've inspired to say, okay, we'll just keep farming. We'll let the game come to us. But like when you're sitting there at 18 minutes and you're down 3,000 gold because your jungler has done literally nothing throughout the entire game, it does start to get a bit tilting. I do understand that there is a method behind the madness, but sometimes the madness is just not the correct decision. In this game, it ended up working out, not really because of Inspired. He had a couple of huge ultimates on the Malphite, specifically towards the end of that game, but like, overall, I don't think he was the most important player on the Rift. They kind of won because of bot lane tempo and Dokla finding a lot of picks, and I think Inspired was more so along for the ride. But if you notice a bit of a red color on LYON's side, Saint, for me, is actually going to get dud of the game on the winning side. He tried his best to lose this once again for LYON. I'm sorry, this guy is just not playing well right now. I mean, what a terrible start to the series for Saint. This is by far the best matchup anyone in this game has in terms of going into the enemy team. Victor has very few ways to be like really taken advantage of, and he should be able to output a ridiculous amount of damage. He kind of shuts down the Annie Wukong combo. It's one of the more consistent mid lane picks into this matchup. He's awesome into Annie in lane in particular as well. Plays out the Malphite engages in an incredibly strong way because he can drop the W on top of wherever Malphite ultimates and stun them immediately after. Like, this should be a free game for Victor, and yet somehow, someway, he dies twice solo in the laning phase. Completely absurd. Like, really just horribly played by Saint. He tried his best to give as much gold to JDG as possible and succeeded in the early game. Luckily for him, the rest of his team ended up stepping up and keeping things neutral. But if Berserker and Isles didn't dominate the 2v2, this game would have been over because Saint would have given too much gold over to the middle of the map. So Saint, it was the worst player on the Rift. I don't think there's any question about that. JDG actually had an okay game. All things considered, they just didn't win the fights that they really needed to. Xiaoshu was awesome in those team fights on the Rumble. He's actually been really good in the 5v5s at this tournament. Reminds me a lot of how Perfect played at Worlds for KT Rolster, where it's just like this random team fight breakout when he's never really been all that dominant in terms of a team fight player. It's still cool to see that Xiaoshu was capable of doing it. I don't know how much this is going to last in terms of, oh, Xiaoshu's a player kind of known for his 1v1 ability, and now he's just popping off in team fights. It's good to see. The Rumble was massive, and theoretically, this could have won the game here. It was the highest damage champion in the game, maybe outside of the Corki, in terms of how things broke down. I didn't see the damage charts, but I would presume the Rumble is going to be pretty high up there, and I think Xiaoshu played it well. Unfortunately, he just couldn't do it all on his own. Junja had a great game. I think on the Wukong, he was getting prepped for like a player of the game. Gala's KDA looks great on the Jhin. He was down 80 CS or something like that, and 3 of those 7 kills came in a fountain dive, or I guess in the end at the the finish of the game, like in the Nexus, mostly because, LYON was sacrificing their own lives to make sure they could end the game. It was the correct call, but Gala gets a couple of extra kills for it, so don't necessarily look at the KDA. His game was pretty terrible, and he was definitely in the running for dead of the game. Same thing for Vampire. On the other side, the bot lane gap was just absolutely massive between these two, and Gala and Vampire need to start stepping up. They were outplayed in the finals. They were also a pretty big problem for this team in the regular season in that same vein. I'm not going to say they were the weak links. Junja had a couple of bad moments in the regular season as well, but right now they are very much the weak links of this series, where Berserker and Isles are just consistently getting significantly more advantages to them in these games. So now we're going into game 3 all tied up. Thank God we will not have a 6-game day. We finally have a series on our hands, and both game 1 and game 2 were incredibly entertaining and really back and forth. I'm hopeful we get another fun one in game number 3, but this is, as you guys know, in my opinion, the most important game in this series. If you can pick up a win here, having to only win one of the final 2 games takes a lot of pressure off the back, and you don't want to be that team that has to win 2 in a row in order to get themselves into the semifinals. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1 and regain full control of what this final qualification series is looking like, as we are looking to end the group stage very, very shortly. A much cleaner, much better game from JDG. Certainly their best across this series up until this point. Game 1, very much not in their favor. They win one team fight and the game is over. Game 2, very much in their favor, but they throw it all away at the end of the game by getting outscaled and not playing the fights particularly well. This was a much better overall package from JDG, certainly the best that they've looked here today, and it looks like they are finding their form at the right time. As we get further and further along into Fearless, I think things are going to get even better for JDG as opposed to LYON, who have a very specific way that they can play the game, and this is a big draft from LYON because they get a couple of big power picks in this one that I think, now that they're off the board, it's going to be more difficult. Mbessa, Rise, things like that that this team really likes to play towards, those are not going to be available again. They were barely available in this game to be able to pick on the counter pick side, so overall, definitely a big win for JDG to be able to pick up, and for LYON, just goes to show that they are a bit outclassed here. The team fighting is just not there. This team, is very vocal. Inspired has been very vocal about how he thinks the game should be played right now, and how he thinks Western teams can beat Eastern teams, which is to say, he's gone on record, going, oh, we're not going to beat them in lane. Like, they're just better mechanically. They get these small advantages. Their macro is really solid. But if we can get these, like, weird team fight engages, if we can, get to the 5v5s, that's where we can start to be a bit more creative. And that's where, at least he believes, that the mechanical difference can kind of be less impactful. I don't necessarily agree with that in full. I think that there is part of that is correct. I think generally the idea that, early game is much more, I guess mechanic focused is true. Like, if you are the better player, typically you're going to get significant leads more regularly, even in neutral matchups, so long as there's not something super outstanding in draft. But I think mid-game, to me, is where teams separate themselves from being, like, great to not great. I think, that is where you are going to start to see teams kind of break things open if you can play the side lanes better, and if you can, obviously, survive in the mid-game and not get completely destroyed, and LYON just isn't very good at that. Their mid-game is really slow, really passive. They do basically nothing in that part of the game, and then they just go out and lose. They are really aggressive early, really aggressive late, and they do nothing in the middle, and I think that's why this team has not found a ton of success consistently at this tournament. But We'll go ahead and talk about it here. Vampire is pretty obviously player of the game. Massive performance from him on the Rakan. You know, Berserker and Isles, we've hyped them up a ton over the course of this series because they've been dominating the 2v2, and that has been utterly correct up until this series, or up until this game here in game number 3. Berserker and Isles were fantastic in the first 2 games, but this is kind of the version of this bot lane that I think we expected going into this series, where Gala and Vampire were super neutral, you know, didn't really have to pressure out this Ezreal Leona all that much in the laning phase, and Vampire was a significantly better playmaker throughout a lot of the end of the game. If Isles isn't generating massive advantages in the 2v2, he's really not that valuable of a player, at least in the current form that we've seen him in throughout this year. I think he has the skill set to potentially get better in other areas, but that's why I really don't like picks like Leona that this team has consistently gone towards, because Leona, while it can just, you know, press Q and shut down the Rakan in theory, it becomes a lot more difficult to do that when you have a player who does not feel comfortable playing super aggro or is in the wrong place, wrong time throughout a lot of the mid to end game, because that is the case for Isles. He just doesn't have great awareness in terms of where he needs to be in comparison to like LPL and LCK supports. Obviously, I think it's totally fine for a North American player, but we're comparing him on an international level, and you know, he is not going to be as good as Vampire is at playing these engagers towards the end of these games, and that was abundantly clear. And obviously, we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to Isles, who was out of position quite a bit this game. But Vampire, I think, he put on a masterclass. He put on a clinic for this Rakan performance. Xayah Rakan has really fallen out of favor because Xayah is very weak right now, but Rakan, still a very valuable pick if you can play it well, and Vampire very much did. Gala still did his thing in this game, though. Definitely started to pick up some steam in the team fights, went neutral in the laning phase, and kind of did his job. This was probably his best game of the series up until this point. Nice to see him actually be able to, you know, do fine enough in a 2v2. They were very good domestically in 2v2, so it's kind of shocking that they've been so bad in this series, but overall, this is definitely much more comfortable for the bot lane for them. I think Xiaoshu was massive in this game, and quite frankly, he's just been better than Dokla. Dokla was great in the team fights on Cassante in game number 2, but his laning phases have been pretty lackluster across this entire tournament, and Xiaoshu was clearly a more mechanically talented player, and he's able to generate significant leads on his own on the top side. This Zehen was very difficult to deal with, and I guess that kind of transitions. I never really talked about draft. I guess I should bring that up. I definitely prefer JDG's draft. I think they have significantly more options in this game. Not only do I think that it's a lot more straightforward how they win, because Vi Ari is really great at being able to find picks, and if you make mistakes as LYON, you're going to get punished incredibly hard for that with the comp that they had drafted. But also, this Zehen becomes incredibly difficult to deal with as this game goes along. One of the things I actually dislike the most, and something I really want to disagree with Atlas in particular on this cast, is like, he was really adamant that the Mbessa should be flexed to jungle and that we should get a crazy pick on the top side. I hate playing Mbessa jungle into Vi. I think that this is a really hard matchup to play out, because Vi can not only single you out and stop a lot of your dashes, but even more so than that, Vi's tempo in the mid game is just significantly more than what Mbessa can put out, and Mbessa kind of needs those resources in order to be useful in the later part of the game. We always think about this Mbessa who can dive into the backline and become this nuisance even behind in gold, but that's because top lane gold is so consistent generally that even if you're behind, you're going to be in an okay spot. Inspired was up 2 levels for a majority of this game and still did less damage in my, at least in the relevant fights, than Vi. I didn't get to see the damage charts because I threw up the wrong one at the end of the game, but, you know, I don't like this matchup really at all. I think Ryze is great. Obviously, this champion's OP, and Saint was able to pick up a solo kill because of that in the laning phase, because Hongq just forgot how good Ryze is, generally speaking, but he also got caught a ton on side lanes. You know, again, it's just Saint's not a very good player at playing side lanes. He's bad in the mid game. Happens every time. And Dokla bringing the Aurora onto the top side, I hate this for this team, because not only does it take away what Dokla does best, which is find interesting flank angles in team fights and really try to be a stable presence on the top side, it forces this into being more of a feast or famine matchup, but it also gives Xiaoshu the tools to play even more aggressive the later the game goes, because he doesn't have to worry about a time CC coming in from the top side of the map. This Zehen gets even stronger, the Vi gets even stronger with another great target to lock it down, and you kind of avoid what I think is a better Ari counter matchup with the Aurora into the mid lane. Overall, I just really don't like this from LYON. I've said very vocally on this channel multiple times that I think LYON is like pretty by far the worst drafting team at this tournament. I just don't think they have a good understanding of what the meta is, and I don't think they have a good understanding of what they're even really all that comfortable with. Maybe part of that just comes down to gameplay, but it feels like every game I'm walking out going, okay, I get the idea for LYON, but I feel like it's the wrong direction, and I feel like you're giving yourself a harder time than you need to, and I think that's exactly what happened again here. Isles is dead of the game. I don't really think I have to explain this too much. This guy was late to so many fights, and he was, you know, early to other fights as well, and then stealing kills left and right with the ultimate. Like, it was just a bad game from Isles. Like, this just felt like nerves. Like, there's nothing else really to say. He felt and looked very nervous on the stage, and if that's going to be the case, then that's going to be the case. I mean, we knew that obviously Isles was going to be a bit of a liability for this team internationally. I think that came to fruition in earlier parts of this tournament. This series, it's looked really good in the 2v2. They need to get back to that, because Berserker and Isles playing a, you know, weak side safe safe bot lane just goes against what LYON has been able to win every single part of this series through. Like in game 1 and game 2, they generated their advantages because Berserker was able to play a strong 2v2, and then immediately they go away from that. It's super frustrating, but for LYON, they just need to get back to basics. I don't want to see you play for Saint. I don't even really want to see you play for Inspired. I need to see this team play for bot lane because clearly that is the avenue with which they can generate their advantages. For JDG, I have a feeling they're feeling pretty good about this going into game number 4. They probably want to close this out here and kind of showcase that the beginning of this series was more of an outlier than the regular, but there definitely is a chance for LYON to get back into this. We've seen them be competitive in this series up until this point. So are they going to keep themselves alive here in game number 4? Are they going to push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, or will JDG shut the door on North America's hopes and push their way into top 4? Well, the winner of game number 4 was JD Gaming. JDG are going to take game number 4. They're going to take this series 3-1, and they are going to punch their ticket to a rematch of the LPL finals in the semifinals of First Stand into the top 4. Very exciting for them. You have to be excited for JDG, a team that I think a lot of people kind of came into this tournament a lot lower on than, you know, I was, clearly, obviously, but a lot lower on than maybe even other top-tier teams from the LCK and the LPL in the past. I understand why people generally have that reputation over JDG, but as somebody who had that team number 1 in my power rankings in the LPL at times in the regular season, obviously not towards the end, but at times in the regular season, and obviously had been a big defender of them on, you know, my LPL English cast for a long time, I'm not surprised by this at all. I think people look at a very boring, very safe, very, you know, I don't want to say consistent because they're not consistent, but, you know, very like normal team and the way that they play the game that isn't ridiculously mechanically talented, that just has good macro, team fights relatively well, understands where they need to be. They look at a team like that and they go, oh, they're going to be the kind of team that underperforms at an international tournament. I'm sorry, that's just not who JDG have been. They're going to continue to be underrated and undervalued across the entire year because the way they play isn't flashy or sexy or whatever you want to call it, but they continue to be successful. They've taken down top-tier teams regularly across their time in the LPL, and now they punched their ticket into top 4. I'm not going to sit here and say that they took down the toughest team in the world to get there in LYON, but it's something BNK FearX couldn't do on the other side of this matchup, and quite frankly, I'm not sure that a lot of other LPL teams would have been able to go up against a LYON team in this series that at least tried things and came out on top. So credit to JDG, they lived up to expectations, and I think that is the best possible thing you can say about this series for them. As for LYON on the other side, it's just so obvious what their problem is. Like, they're the easiest team to kind of analyze right now, which is both a blessing and a curse for them, if we're being honest, because it means that they can fix it because it's very clear where they are losing games, but it's a hard thing to fix because it's so ingrained on some of these players, and quite frankly, if it was something that I had a lot of faith was going to be fixed on some of these players, it would have already been fixed at this point. There are a couple of players that I think are going to struggle from a mechanical perspective at a top tier level. Isles, I think, had a great game number 4, but ultimately didn't have nearly as much of an impact as Vampire did on the other side throughout this series, unless you're not counting the laning phase. Again, Isles was not the problem outside of game number 3, in my opinion. Even then, it was more of a team macro problem than it was specifically an Isles issue. I think Dokla had his moments in team fights, but for the most part was generally significantly less useful than Xiaoshu in basically every matchup. On the other side here, again, he had some moments in game 2 on the Cassante, but for the most part was the weaker top laner. But the real issue for me with this team is they have no patience. They have no restraint in terms of how they play the game. I think that is the word that I would like to use. There is no restraint on this team at all. There is no critical thinking in terms of their mid game. Like, people can talk about their early game advantages, and I think it's fair to say that their early games have been very good. Not that that should be surprising. You've got some pretty mechanically talented players in the middle of your team with Inspired, Saint, and Berserker that I think can all generate their own leads even against top tier LCK and LPL talent. The problem is that in the mid game, Inspired wants to shut off, he wants to not fight, he wants to play super passive, and Saint and Berserker can't help themselves but try and go for hero plays because they just think that they're the guy, right? Like, that's just the way that it goes. Saint has always believed that he's the guy. It was my biggest negative on him coming over to North America from the Challengers League, is that he played like he was 1v9ing every game, despite the fact that he almost never was in terms of his setup. And then Berserker in this game kind of took it upon himself to say, okay, I got an early kill on the Aphelios, I understand that I'm the win condition, I gotta flash in and try and pick up kills here even if I'm trading 1-for-1. And it's just a horrible mentality. I don't understand why we're playing hero ball nearly as much as we are. Inspired looked omega tilted by it. It felt like this series was slowly slipping out of control, but Inspired is partly to blame as well. As much as I really like Inspired, and I do think the way that he thinks is okay to play into, you know, top Eastern teams, I think that there is a chance that saying, okay, we're playing for early and late game while, you know, we just try and bridge the gap in the mid game. it has to be like sustainable for the rest of the team, and it just wasn't. Saint and Berserker, Saint in particular, is just too bad in the mid game. He's going to try and look for aggressive plays. So when Inspired basically says, I'm taking the next 5 minutes off to go and farm camps, like the rest of the team needs to be on board with that, and they just weren't in this game. So super frustrating. It feels like LYON are just not connected, and it feels like their ideas for how to play the game are just super backwards right now. I'm very out on this team coming out of this tournament. Maybe that is an unpopular opinion. They took a game off of JDG. Maybe there is something to be excited about there, but I think the underlying process here is bad, and I'm worried about them moving forward. We'll talk about them a bit more in a minute. Gala, for me, is going to get player of the game for game 4. First real major game from him. He was good on the Xayah in game number 3. I really don't have anything against that game. He just didn't have to do all that much in that one. He was the guy in this game. Most damage in the game by far, although Berserker was relatively close on the Aphelios, but absolutely decimating people in late game. Team fights basically went untouched throughout the back end of the game the moment that JDG started to really clearly establish their lead, and he made it worthwhile to draft around these hyper carries. LYON was the side that opted into this hyper carry trade, this Aphelios versus Jinx matchup, except they banned out the Lulu and they gave over the Thresh, so they had to play it with the Nautilus, which is significantly worse in the later part of the game. I hate this in the idea for them, like idea-wise, draft-wise for them. I really don't like that in terms of how it just ends up breaking down. I do think you have some advantages elsewhere, but Poppy can still be incredibly strong here, and you have to hope and pray that your Azir doesn't completely run it down in the mid lane, which unfortunately Saint was really happy to do. He fell for, I don't know, LEC Azir syndrome. Does that even count if it's the LCS, right? He just made some horrible plays throughout this entire series. His positioning was bad. His laning was bad. Basically, all of it was bad in this game, which is a problem because at least his laning was good in the other games and in the other series in this one. But unfortunately for Berserker, he just didn't have enough help on this team. He needed a support that could actually facilitate him more, and he didn't have that. Gala was in a better spot to be able to win fights, and that's why he did end up going out there winning fights. So credit to Gala. He was really important yesterday when they faced off against Loud. Also stepped up here in game 4. Good to see. Player of the series, kind of up for debate. I'm going to lean towards Junja in the jungle, if only because those smites were incredibly relevant and did end up actually affecting the series quite a bit. He obviously gets the Elder one at the end of this game, but outside of that, he also was just super consistent in terms of picking up neutral objectives whenever they 50-50'd across all 4 of these games. The Poppy was fine. I don't think he was dominant, but I think he was really good. I think he was looking for some plays in the mid game that did not end up working out, but in the team fights that really mattered, he ended up playing a lot of protection for this Mel in particular, not just the Jinx, because the Jinx was kind of covered by the Thresh. You play a lot of protection for the Mel, you have a lot more damage in the fights. Junja did a good job of being able to facilitate. I think Vampire is in the running for player of the series as well. Should go to one of those two, in my opinion. Vampire is going to go undervalued for how good he was on the Thresh in this game, but he had a couple of major hooks, and quite frankly, his positioning in general was just super advantageous to JDG. I don't think had a bad game. In fact, he had a couple of really nice moments throughout the early game here on the Nautilus. Obviously, the laning phase where he's able to pick up that first kill onto Vampire is huge, and then there were a couple of team fights where I thought he played really well, but Vampire, I think, overall had much better of an understanding of what he needed to do during the game. Honky was solid, definitely better than Saint. We'll talk about that. Has more to do with Saint. I really don't have a ton to say about Honkyu. The Mel ended up working out, and Xiaoshu was unkillable by the end of this game. I don't think this Scion is actually unkillable, but the problem is that LYON was indexing their damage into the wrong parts of the team, and Xiaoshu just ended up becoming pretty Omega because of it. So overall, really nice win for JDG. They get themselves into top 4. They have the more winnable matchup in the semifinals. I'm not going to say they're favorites by any stretch going into the team that beat them twice in the playoffs, but they took Billy to 5 games in the playoffs domestically. There is a real shot that they can, pick up a win and maybe shock some people and get top 2. And then for LYON on the other side, I mean, again, it's just so clear. Saint is done of the game for me. I'm sorry. I'm out. I'm so out on Saint. I just am. I don't get it. I don't understand at this point how you can continue to make the same mistakes that you were making in the Challengers League 3 years ago. It just, no progression, no development. It's actually starting to upset me in terms of just the way that things are going. He is an incredibly mechanically talented player with a really good understanding of how to play lane matchups, and then he completely falls off in the late game. He's either late to fights because he doesn't understand the timers, he's overextended in a side lane and getting caught out, he's playing team fights too fast or too aggressively, which he did super commonly in this game. He's diving in to try to make a hero play when he's playing Azir with an Aphelios comp with 3 tanks that wants to play front to back. I just don't really understand where he's getting a lot of his decisions. He is a solo queue player. That is it, right? Right now, he is all hype. He is all mechanics. There is nothing else there at the current moment, and that is why he's getting abused by a lot of the top tier mid laners right now at the international level. Chovy obviously made him look pretty silly, but he was losing to Envy at times in his matchup against Loud, and obviously Hongq was definitely better than him in this series. I just don't really know what to do at this point. Saint has so much mechanical talent, and he has absolutely nowhere to put it, and it's definitely starting to get frustrating because he actually was the weak link on this team at this tournament. You would have thought it would have been Isles or maybe even Dokla on the top side. Isles had a lot of bad moments, especially in that series against Loud, and obviously was super outplayed against Gen G, but like, Saint was worse to me. Saint was the weakest player on this team, was the reason that they weren't able to overcome, their own, I guess, problems and be able to evolve and improve. And quite frankly, this is no different than the version of him that we saw domestically. He just can't get away with it against teams that are better than him mechanically, and that's what we saw here. Inspired also, I think there is a conversation to have about his mentality and about how he just completely ignores the mid game. Like, just does not exist to him. I think if you're going to do that, you have to draft a little bit different than this. Outside of that, I can't blame Inspired for this. He had a really great early start to the series and then just kind of tapered off as obviously morale ended up going down. Berserker did 1 billion damage in this game, but he also has a bit too much of a hero syndrome in him, which is frustrating because domestically he did absolutely nothing. He was like super passive and, just wanted to like slowly start to develop like leads in the 2v2. He wasn't playing like he had any ego at all. And in this game, he had too much ego, flashing in on the Aphelios and getting caught. Dokla is not really to blame, but he also just got outskilled on the top side. Really not a lot of positive for me to say about LYON. I get that they're losing in a way that's more expected. Like, not everybody can beat G2 and go out and upset an LCK team. I'm not trying to say that LYON even had those expectations, but what I'm saying is I would have at least loved to see the process work out. These games were close and very winnable, but the problems that they ran into are problems that are going to continue to be an issue throughout the rest of the year until they solve them, because the hands are good and the decision-making is just not. They need to understand how to play these fights better. Hopefully they can evolve, but right now they are a really frustrating watch. And then for JDG on the other side, this is, again, obviously massive. This team is very, very, like, I guess, sneaky right now. I think that is the word that I'm looking for. There is a non-zero chance that this is a team that makes it to the finals. I'm not saying they're favorited to do that, but this is a team that understands exactly who they are, how they want to play the game, and can pretty realistically execute on a lot of the ideas they have envisioned for themselves. I think they draft relatively well, and now they get a rematch with the team that they actually did pretty well against throughout most of the LPL split. They beat them in the regular season. They took them to 5 in the upper bracket finals, and obviously not the grand finals, but the upper bracket finals. Like, JDG are not, it's not impossible for them to be able to beat Billy Gaming and move on. They are certainly going to, have their work cut out for them, but if they play anything like they did, especially in the final 2 games of this series, I think it definitely could be in the cards for them to at least make it fun. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2026 First Stand Group Stage Day number 5 overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for the group stage here at First Stand. We now know our 4 teams that have made it out of our 2 respective groups. Of course, we determined the number 1 seeds a couple of days ago with Billy Gaming and Gen G coming out from the, without losing a series, coming out from the upper bracket, if you want to say it like that. And then, of course, today, G2 Esports and JD Gaming qualifying out of the lower bracket. That means every other team has officially been eliminated. We say goodbye to FearX and to LYON after today's games, and obviously, they put up respectable fights. They at least made things interesting in a couple of their games, but were not quite good enough to make it into the top 4. But that is now what we get to look forward to, is our semifinals and finals, and this is where it really becomes important. It turns into single elimination from this point onwards at this tournament. You either win or you go home. No extra life, even for the teams coming out as the number 1 seed. You kind of forfeit your extra life by coming in as that number 1 seed. So I'm super excited for everything moving forward. Only 2 more days. The semifinals will take place tomorrow, and then, of course, the finals on Sunday, which is very exciting. We can preview these matchups right now and talk about who is expected to win. The more obvious one is going to be Gen G going into G2. I mean, I love that G2 is here. Like, it's awesome that this team was able to pull off the upset against FearX and get themselves into this top 4, but this is almost certainly where the road ends. I mean, if they win a game against Gen G, that is a massive, massive upset. I think Gen G has already beaten a better team 3-0 in one of the fastest best-of-5s that we've seen all year in JD Gaming. Gen G also, of course, lost a game to BNK FearX in the upper bracket finals. Obviously, they swept them in grand finals, but G2 kind of dismantling them maybe gives you some idea that they can be, some kind of, relevant team. I don't don't think this matchup is good. Gen G are the best team in the world at taking things slow, at playing methodical, and G2 don't really have the firepower to be able to take the game to Gen G and put them in disadvantageous lane matchups early. I just think this is going to be a bit of a problem. Keen into Broken Blade sounds like a nightmare. Hans played awesome against FearX. He's going to have to be even better against Ruler if he wants any chance of being able to survive. Labrov into Duro also sounds like a nightmare matchup. I imagine G2 will be going out here 0-3. Gen G should be moving on. Again, their goal right now, from my perspective, is to finish the tournament undefeated. I think it's pretty realistic to expect them to, at least hope that they can get that done. And then for our second series, this one is theoretically a lot closer. We've obviously seen it a ton across this year. Up until this point, Billy Gaming taking on JD Gaming, a rematch of the LPL Finals. Two teams that have faced off a ton. They faced off in upper bracket finals. They faced off twice in the regular season as well, both coming out of Group Ascend. And they have a lot of experience going up against each other. Hongq does have a bit of a montage right now going overnight in the mid lane in terms of solo kills, but generally BLG has gotten the better of JD Gaming. I believe in the 4 series that they played against each other in 2026, I believe that BLG has won 3 of them, 1 in the regular season, and then of course upper finals and grand finals in the playoffs. However, JDG did take a matchup against them in the regular season. I believe they took a game in the best of 3 off of them as well in the one that they lost, and they pushed them to 5 games in the upper bracket finals. They are not like complete underdogs in this. They are definitely a team that can very much compete with BLG. The question is, like, are BLG ramping up at the right time? And the answer to that for me is pretty much yeah. Like, I think Bin is in a better spot now than he's been in a while, and I think that he has been taking over this tournament, very similar to Keen on the other side of this bracket. And I think you can talk about the Knight into Hongq matchup as being pretty Knight favored. Hongq's gotten the solo kills, but Knight's been more relevant in these games, even though he was been going down in resources. I think Shun's been pretty good. I think the bot lane is inconsistent for both sides. Viper and Gala have both not been playing up to their own standards, but I think both can, at least have some advantages on obviously a very different player than Vampire. JDG want to play more for the 2v2 isolated in the bot lane, whereas On wants to get out on the map and move around and play with Shun a little bit more. I think BLG are favorites. I think we saw that in the finals, why they were favorites and, why they were considered to be the best team coming out of the LPL, and we've seen nothing to the contrary so far, especially after that dominant win over G2 3-0 in that upper bracket finals. I'm predicting BLG and Gen G to make it to the finals, but let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down in the comments section below. Do you think G2 or JDG have the chance to upset the major tournament favorites, or do you think it's going to be stock standard and we're going to have LCK versus LPL, or I guess, theoretically we probably will, but if we're going to have LCK 1 versus LPL 1 in the finals? I'm curious to know your thoughts down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it for today's video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering the semifinals and the finals in the same exact way we've covered this entire tournament up until this point, and with spring right around the corner, you're going to want to be around this channel because we cover the LCS, the LEC, the LCK, and the LPL every single week on this channel. NACLE Tier 2 in North America is starting up soon. The primers are going to be out, sometime soon before the beginning of spring, and I just cannot wait to cover domestic leagues again and to see how the rest of this tournament goes. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LOL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all